Hello, I'm Heather Anderson, and today I'm going to talk to you about the lads of Brandon who served in the Great War. Brandon is a small market town on the Norfolk-Suffolk border, known for its flint industry and its rabbit fur processing industry. The lads from Brandon sometimes worked in these fur processing industries. They also worked as laborers, farmers, rail workers, or at shops in town. On August 4th, 1914, life forever changed for the people of Britain and for the people of Brandon. War had been declared against Germany after Germany refused to remove its troops for Belgium. The men of England needed to prepare for war. Career soldiers such as James Dyer and reservists such as George Branch were mobilized and sent to Europe. George Branch was the first lad from Brandon who did not make it home. On August 24th, 1914, Lance Corporal Branch, serving in the Norfolk Regiment, was killed in action during the Battle of Mons. This was the first major action between Britain and Germany in World War I. His brothers Herbert and William also served with the Norfolk Regiment and would survive the war. If Britain had any hope of winning the war, she would need more soldiers, and soon a recruitment campaign began for what would be known as the New Army, also known as Kitchener's Army, or PALS battalions. Horatio Herbert Kitchener, 1st Earl Kitchener, became a Secretary of State of War on August 5, 1914, and started a recruitment campaign to enlist men ages 19 to 39 who were over the height of 5 foot 3 inches. 2,466,719 men enlisted between August 1914 and December 1915. 49 of those men were lads from Brandon who went off to nearby Norwich, volunteering to serve with the 7th Norfolk Regiment. They were perhaps looking to defend their country, seek adventure, or may have been enticed by Lord Kitchener's promise that these early volunteers could serve alongside their mates and be the first to be demobilized after the war. The excitement and the promise of adventure, being a hero to your country, would soon fade as the Brandon lads faced their first major battle and saw their mates from childhood die in front of them. Perhaps the first casualty from Brandon in the New Army was Bertie Edwards. He was only 19 years old when he was struck by a piece of shell. His older brother Herbert served in the same battalion and wrote home to their parents telling them he stuck it very bravely. Herbert would survive the war. In a letter to Mr. and Miss Walter Talbot of Brandon, Corporal Henry Wharf, another lad from Brandon, describes the death of his friend, Private Walter Talbot, Jr. He says, "I was the last to see him, and I want to assure you all of his great bravery. It was he alone that got half the trench back and saved us all from getting wiped out. Somehow between us, we used their bombs and sent them back. Walter threw them, and I got them ready. It was impossible for me to do anything, as they were so close to us. We were always the best of friends, I might almost say like brothers, as we seldom did anything without each other's consent. So I assure you I share your loss and miss a great friend. A bullet passed through my back, and I have to lie in bed now for nearly a month." He goes on to say, "I read with much regret about Albert Royal. We saw him in the trench, but somehow or other I saw no more of him." Albert Royal was another Brandon lad who joined Kitchener's army. In one day, Brandon lost 2 of its sons, and another was injured. Nonetheless, patriotic fervor would continue to sweep the nation for a time. The desire to join the war effort was so intense for one lad from Brandon, Jack Edwards. He wanted to enlist at the start of the war. However, there was one problem. Jack was 15. A year later, on June 1st, 1915, young Jack traveled to Norwich and enlisted under the false identity of John Edwards, a 19-year-old cycle mechanic. He was sent the 40 or so miles away to Colchester for training. After his parents realized what had happened, they produced his birth certificate to get him out of service. His captain, Captain Bavis, from his battalion, wrote to military authorities on his behalf asking if Jack can stay on as a bugler. His lieutenant, Lieutenant Barrow, asked the War Office to keep Jack as a special case, serving at home until he were old enough, in view of the fact the man does not want to be discharged. This was all for naught, as Jack was sent back to civilian life. When he turned 18, he enlisted for the second time and served with the Liverpool Regiment. On May 23, 1918, at the age of 19, Edward Jack Edwards would become another lad from Brandon who did not make it home. As the war carried on, more lads from Brandon enlisted in the Great War. Altogether, 251 of Brandon's lads left to serve their country, joining regiments such as the Norfolk Regiment, Suffolk Regiment, and the King's Rifle Royal Corps, among others. 65 of those men never returned home. The Battle of the Somme began on July 1st, 1916, and was the day Brandon lost 6 young men to the slaughter. Albert Carter, Arthur Field, Cyril Burton, Francis Mutnam, William Longwood, and Frederick Talbot. On that day, the 7th Norfolks and the Brandon lads found themselves on the front line on that first day of battle. At 5:30 a.m., the lads were served cups of tea in the trenches, preparing themselves for the onslaught to come. At 7:30, the assault began, and by 8, the men had crossed the first German trench. As they advanced beyond this trench, they were met by German machine gunners, who were waiting, immediately inflicting heavy casualties on the regiment. Their losses were heavy. The battalion alone had lost 105 men, 227 were wounded, and 13 were unaccounted for. This all happened in less than 10 hours of fighting. The battle would rage on, wounding dozens of men from Brandon, and killing 4 more: Herbert Grass, Robert Docking, Ernest Thompson, and Herbert Tilney. That was the thing about the Pals battalions. One battle could devastate a whole town. Not only the people back home, but all the lads serving together. They grew up together, they fought together, and some died together. The year 1917 came, bringing more death to the lads of Brandon. In total, 20 lads would never make it home that year. This was more deaths of Brandon servicemen than any other year in the 20th century. In World War II, Brandon saw 23 deaths throughout the whole war. 1917 would prove to be the toughest year yet. The lads from Brandon moved from fighting in Europe to fighting in the Middle East in places like Gaza, Egypt, Palestine, and Mesopotamia. 3 lads from Brandon fought and died at the Second Battle of Gaza: Frederick Hensby, George Wicks, and Harry Docking. Harry was the brother of Robert Docking, who fought and died at the Battle of the Somme a year earlier. George Wicks was also at the Battle of the Somme with the Brandon lads. He survived, but was severely wounded. Once he was recovered enough to fight, he was sent to Egypt, where he marched the 200 miles to Gaza, where he was mortally wounded. Back in Belgium, the Third Battle of Ypres claimed more Brandon lads: Ernest Brown and John Wells. Bertie Docking, Bertie Challis, Bill Adams, and Edward Kent were other lads from Brandon who took part in this battle. The battle took place July 31st to November 10th, 1917, and shaped our modern perceptions of the Western Front when it comes to trench warfare. In over 100 days, the Allies advanced roughly 5 miles and lost over 250,000 soldiers. Unseasonably heavy rain continued for over 3 weeks, leaving soldiers to struggle through heavy, sticky mud, at times up to their waists. German losses were around 200,000, a loss from which they could not recover. The Allies, however, would soon receive reinforcements from the Americans, who had recently joined the war effort. The year 1918 saw pressure for more men to enter the war, and the age of conscription reached 55 years old. More lads from Brandon would fight, and 12 more would lose their lives. The last name listed on the Brandon War Memorial for service in the Great War belongs to William Mutnam. He died here in Brandon from the Spanish flu that swept the nation in 1918. He had recently been discharged when he died after returning home. The war ended on November 11th, 1918, but the battle at home was far from over. Life would never be the same in Brandon. Sons, fathers, husbands, friends would never be seen again, and those that did return home would never be the same after experiencing the horrors of war. Some of the men had been taken prisoners of war and started to return home. Ernest Talbot, Bert Wicks, John Lynch, who was taken prisoner in 1915, Frederick Edwards, Private Charles Talbot, Private Alfred James Talbot, Walter Stanley, Nichols, Richard Henry Zipfel, Frederick Wolseley Peacock, Sarge L.W. Matthews, Cecil Crocker, and John Bullock. Some men returned to Brandon missing limbs, such as Percy Basham and E.G. Thorpe, who had their right arms amputated, and George Wells, who had his leg amputated. Some men returned home physically okay, but came home with shell shock, today known as post-traumatic stress disorder. Harry Ashley, Walter Field, and Percy Wilby. The National Archives estimates over 250,000 British men suffered from shell shock during the war. Darren Norton, a local Brandon historian, notes that due to conscription beginning in 1916, it is likely that the names of those killed between 1917 and 1918 included some lads who were conscripts. Due to this fact, Brandon's War Memorial is not a shrine to heroes and warriors, but instead to victims of the war, torn away from their families, never intending to inflict violence on another human being. Not all victims from the war were killed, and many more were affected by physical or mental disabilities. Each name on Brandon's War Memorial is the name of a man with a story. Each of the 251 men from Brandon who enlisted in the war effort has a story. With the time constraint of this project, I was unable to tell each of their stories. However, all of these men matter equally, and each story is equally important. I will close this video with each of the names listed on Brandon's War Memorial, so that we can take a moment to remember them. With proud thanksgiving, a mother for her children, England mourns for her dead across the sea. Flesh of her flesh they were, spirit of her spirit, fallen in the cause of the free. Thank you.